Imagine you're walking down the street on a sunny afternoon, your mind preoccupied with thoughts of the day ahead. Suddenly, a sharp voice calls out, "Hey, stop right there!" You freeze, unsure if it's directed at you, but as you glance around, you see two officers approaching. Your pulse quickens. You've done nothing wrong, yet the look in their eyes tells you they think otherwise. What would you do in that moment? Would you comply, question, or stay silent? And how would you feel if you knew the reason they stopped you had nothing to do with your actions, but everything to do with how you looked? It was a bright, bustling afternoon in the heart of the city. People moved in hurried streams, jostling for space on crowded sidewalks, their faces a blur of stress and purpose. The hum of cars, distant horns, and conversations created an almost deafening background noise. Among the sea of faces, Angela Miller, a tall, poised black woman in her mid-30s, walked confidently down the street. Dressed in a sharp business suit, her briefcase in hand, she carried herself with the grace and dignity of someone who was used to navigating the complexities of a high-stakes professional life. She had just wrapped up a tough case in court, and although mentally exhausted, she felt a sense of triumph. Her reputation as a prosecutor was unmatched. She had earned the respect of her peers and superiors, fighting for justice in the face of overwhelming challenges. Today, however, she allowed herself a brief moment of relaxation as she walked home, eager to leave behind the courtroom battles and think of nothing but peace for a few hours. As she passed a bustling intersection, her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, commanding voice from behind. "Hey, you there! Stop!" Angela's feet instinctively slowed, but she didn't turn around right away. After years of working in law enforcement, she knew the tone too well. Forceful, authoritative, and undoubtedly directed at her. She sighed internally, feeling the knot of frustration tighten in her chest. This was the part of her reality that she hated the most, being judged before anyone even knew her name. She turned slowly, her calm gaze meeting the eyes of two uniformed officers standing a few yards away. The taller one, Officer Bradley, had a firm grip on his belt, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. His partner, Officer Marks, a shorter, stockier man, had already begun advancing toward her, his expression stern, as if she were an immediate threat. "Yes, officers?" Angela asked, her voice steady but with an edge of controlled annoyance. "You're loitering," Officer Marks snapped, his tone accusatory. "What's your business here?" Angela blinked in disbelief. "Loitering?" She glanced around, seeing dozens of people standing or walking in the same area. A couple of men leaned casually against a nearby building, but they weren't being questioned. The injustice of the situation hit her like a wave, but she had learned to mask her anger well over the years. "I'm on my way home from work," Angela said, her tone measured. "Is there a problem?" "Don't play games with us," Bradley interjected, stepping closer now, his face tightening with irritation. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Let me see some ID." Angela could feel her pulse quickening. This wasn't the first time she had been stopped unjustly, and she had no doubt it wouldn't be the last. But this time, the situation felt more charged, more hostile. She was keenly aware of the fact that she was being singled out. Still, she had no intention of escalating things. Reaching calmly into her purse, she pulled out her wallet and handed them her ID, hoping they'd recognize their mistake and let her go. Officer Marks took the ID, glanced at it briefly, and frowned. He passed it to Bradley, who looked at it with more scrutiny. "Angela Miller," Bradley read aloud, still clearly unimpressed. "And what do you do for a living, Ms. Miller?" "I'm a lawyer," she responded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "A lawyer?" Marks scoffed, his disbelief evident. "Yeah, right. You expect us to believe that?" Angela inhaled deeply, reining in her frustration. The disrespect was suffocating, but she was no stranger to it. She had spent her career battling systemic injustices like this. However, the more Officer Marks pressed, the more Angela knew this wasn't going to end easily. "You're free to verify it," she said, her voice firm but still civil. "I work with the district attorney's office." Bradley's eyebrows raised slightly, though he made no immediate move to verify her identity. Marks, however, wasn't interested in verifying anything. His expression was one of smug superiority, as if he had already made up his mind about her. "You know," Mark said, stepping even closer now, his voice lowering menacingly, "people like you always think you can talk your way out of everything. But not today." Angela's heart began to pound in her chest, not from fear, but from the familiar anger that surged whenever she encountered blatant injustice. She could see the small crowd gathering at the edge of the sidewalk, onlookers curious about the scene unfolding in front of them. "Officer," she began, choosing her words carefully, "you are making a mistake. I suggest you take a moment to verify who I am before this goes any further." But Marks wasn't listening. His mind was set. With a sudden movement, he grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her toward the police car parked nearby. "What are you doing?" Angela exclaimed, her voice rising as she pulled back against his grip. "Let go of me!" "Stop resisting," Mark shouted, drawing even more attention from the bystanders. Bradley moved in to assist, gripping Angela's other arm as they dragged her toward the car. The onlookers gasped, and several people pulled out their phones to start recording. The scene had escalated rapidly, with Angela being treated as if she were a violent criminal. Her heart raced, and she could feel the tension in her body growing as the injustice of the situation became more suffocating. "You're making a huge mistake," Angela warned, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Yeah, we'll see about that," Mark sneered, shoving her into the back seat of the squad car. "Sit tight." As the door slammed shut, the roar of the crowd outside was muted, and Angela was left sitting in the back seat, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. This wasn't her first encounter with the law's unjust side, but the humiliation, the raw disrespect, it cut deep every time. Through the tinted window, she could see the officers speaking to one another, Marks gesturing wildly, while Bradley looked somewhat hesitant. It was clear that at least one of them was beginning to doubt the situation. Angela glanced down at her briefcase, which had been tossed onto the seat beside her. Inside were documents related to the case she had been working on, a case against police misconduct. Ironic, she thought grimly, considering her current predicament. The car door opened, and Bradley peered in, his expression now a mix of suspicion and uncertainty. "Stay quiet back there," he muttered, before slamming the door shut again. Angela leaned her head back against the seat, her mind racing. This was more than just a wrongful arrest. It was a clear example of the systemic issues she had spent her career fighting against. She wasn't just another black woman in the street. She was a prosecutor, someone with the power to change things. And now she would have to use that power to not only defend herself, but to expose the ugly truth of what had just happened. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, and several people were arguing with the officers, demanding to know why Angela had been arrested. One woman, her voice raised in indignation, shouted, "She didn't do anything! Let her go!" But the officers ignored the voices of dissent as they continued their conversation. Sitting in the back of the police car, Angela knew that this incident was far from over. She was determined to turn this humiliating moment into a battle for justice, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been wrongfully accused, mistreated, or targeted simply because of the color of their skin. As the car's engine roared to life and they pulled away from the scene, Angela felt a steely resolve settle over her. She wasn't just fighting for her dignity now, she was fighting for justice. And soon, these officers would realize exactly who they had crossed. The ride to the police station felt long and unnerving. Angela sat quietly in the back of the squad car, her eyes locked on the blurred buildings rushing past the window. Her mind was in overdrive, meticulously planning the next steps. She was no ordinary citizen. They had arrested the wrong woman, and this would soon come crashing down on them in ways they couldn't even begin to imagine. The car eventually slowed as they pulled into the police station parking lot. The officers were still talking in low, serious voices as they exited the vehicle. Officer Marks yanked open the back door and pulled Angela out roughly. His grip on her arm was tight, and she felt the burning frustration of how recklessly they were treating her. Officer Bradley, who had been quieter, followed, his eyes darting back and forth between Angela and Marks, as if he was starting to realize something was amiss. "Let's get her processed," Marks said coldly, as they led Angela inside. Angela kept her head held high, determined not to show any signs of weakness. She was intimately familiar with this process, but from the other side of the law. Usually, she was the one working on cases, examining the flaws in law enforcement, advocating for justice. Now, she was on the other end of the table, a glaring example of the very thing she had fought against for years. Inside, the station was buzzing with the usual activity. Officers moving about, answering phones, typing up reports. The room fell somewhat silent, though, as Angela was led in. Several officers paused to watch, a few raising their eyebrows at the sight of her. She stood out, not just because she was black, but because she was composed in a way that people who had just been arrested usually weren't. There was something about her that commanded attention, an authority that some of the more perceptive officers began to pick up on. Mark shoved her down onto a bench near the processing desk. "Sit tight while we get the paperwork started." Angela narrowed her eyes at him but said nothing. Bradley remained standing a few feet away, clearly uncomfortable now. He approached Marks with a lowered voice. "Are you sure about this?" Bradley asked. "Something doesn't feel right." Marks scoffed and waved him off. "Don't get soft on me now, Brad. We've got a job to do." "Yeah, but—" Bradley hesitated, his gaze drifting toward Angela. "She said she's a lawyer. Maybe we should double-check." Marks turned to face his partner, his expression hardening. "Look, she's some stuck-up lady trying to play us. If she's really a lawyer, she can prove it after we book her. End of story." Bradley's doubt lingered, but he ultimately nodded and turned away, feeling trapped in the momentum of what had already been set in motion. Meanwhile, Angela was acutely aware of everything going on around her. The officers who walked by gave her lingering glances, and she could hear the murmurs of curiosity. But she remained silent, knowing the real game was about to start. As Marks filled out the paperwork, Bradley moved toward a computer terminal. Hesitant, but driven by a gnawing uncertainty, he typed in Angela's name to pull up her records. The screen loaded slowly, and as the results appeared, Bradley's eyes widened in disbelief. The name that appeared wasn't just associated with a lawyer. It was tied to the district attorney's office, one of the highest prosecutors in the state. Bradley's throat tightened. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This wasn't just a mistake. They had arrested someone with serious clout, someone who could upend their careers with a single phone call. Bradley quickly rose from his chair and walked over to Marks, who was still filling out forms at the desk. "Marks, we need to stop this," Bradley said urgently. Marks shot him a look of annoyance. "What now? You need to look at this." Bradley shoved the printout into Marks's hands, his voice low. "She's not just a lawyer. She's with the district attorney's office. She's a prosecutor." Marks glanced at the paper, his brow furrowing as he read. His expression hardened, but this time there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "So what? She's still a suspect until we figure this out." Bradley shook his head, his voice lowering even further. "You don't get it. This isn't just any lawyer. This woman could ruin us. We have to let her go before this gets any worse." Marks clenched his jaw, his pride battling with the reality of the situation. He wasn't the type to back down easily, especially not in front of other officers. But even he could see the storm brewing. Before either of them could speak again, the door to the station opened, and a middle-aged man in a crisp suit walked in, his expression cold and sharp. He was flanked by two other attorneys, all of whom walked with purpose. The entire room fell silent as they approached the desk. "Angela," the man said, his voice controlled but filled with authority. "Are you all right?" Angela looked up, her face relaxing slightly at the sight of the man she recognized. Jason Carr, her legal mentor and one of the most powerful attorneys in the city. His arrival wasn't a surprise. She had expected him to come as soon as she had been arrested. She had friends in high places, and the legal community was tight-knit. News of her wrongful arrest had already spread like wildfire. "I'm fine, Jason," Angela replied, her voice steady. "But I believe these officers have made a terrible mistake." Oh! Jason's gaze flicked to Marks and Bradley, his eyes narrowing as he addressed them. Officers, I suggest you release Ms. Miller immediately unless you want to face a lawsuit that will bury this department. Marks stiffened, his jaw clenched tightly. He was visibly struggling to hold on to the last threads of his authority in this rapidly deteriorating situation. Bradley, on the other hand, had already taken a step back, realizing how deep in trouble they were. Bradley stammered, looking to Marks for support. We didn't realize— You didn't realize who you were dealing with? Jason's voice was cold, cutting through Bradley's excuse. That's a common mistake when people like you assume they can judge someone based on their appearance. Marks opened his mouth to respond, but Jason raised a hand, silencing him. Let me make this clear, Jason continued, his voice rising. This is not going away. You've falsely arrested a state prosecutor, and the evidence is all there. I suggest you get your superior down here immediately, or this entire department will be under investigation by morning. The tension in the room was suffocating now. Marks finally glanced at Bradley, the weight of the situation sinking in fully. Bradley, for all his doubts, felt a wave of relief. At least now someone else could handle the fallout. A few moments later, Lieutenant Hardy arrived, his face stern as he assessed the situation. He was quickly briefed on what had transpired, and his expression darkened as the gravity of the mistake became clear. Release her, Hardy ordered without hesitation, his voice tense with frustration. Bradley quickly stepped forward and uncuffed Angela, his hands shaking slightly as he did so. Angela stood up slowly, smoothing down her suit and straightening her posture. The entire room was watching her, and she knew the power she held in this moment. She could see the fear in Bradley's eyes, the embarrassment in Marks's face, and the discomfort in Hardy's stance. Angela wasn't interested in gloating, though. She wasn't here for revenge, she was here for justice. As she gathered her things, she turned to face the officers, her gaze lingering on Marks. I warned you, she said calmly, her voice laced with quiet strength. This is far from over. Marks looked away, his face flushing with shame. Hardy, still standing nearby, glanced nervously at Jason, aware of the damage control that would be necessary to avoid a public scandal. Jason stepped forward again, his voice carrying authority. We will be in touch, Lieutenant. Expect a formal complaint, and I strongly suggest that both officers involved in this incident be suspended immediately pending an investigation. Hardy gave a stiff nod, clearly eager to end this nightmare as quickly as possible. Understood. Angela walked toward the exit, her head held high. Jason and the other attorneys followed closely behind, leaving behind a room filled with officers too stunned to speak. As they stepped out into the fresh air, Angela allowed herself to breathe deeply, the weight of the situation slowly lifting off her shoulders. But she knew this was only the beginning. What had happened to her wasn't just a personal insult. It was emblematic of a larger, systemic issue that she had fought against her entire career. And now she had first-hand experience of the kind of injustice so many others had faced. Jason, she said as they walked toward his car, we're not just filing a complaint. We're going to bring this entire department to its knees. Jason smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Angela. She nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. They picked the wrong person to mess with. Angela sat in her office the next morning, staring at the city skyline outside her window. The early light bathed the glass towers in a soft glow, but there was nothing peaceful about the battle she was about to wage. Her fingers tapped lightly on the edge of her desk as her mind raced, formulating the strategy that would not only bring justice for her wrongful arrest, but expose the deep-rooted flaws in the system that had allowed it to happen. She wasn't alone in the fight. The incident at the station had already made waves across the legal community. Colleagues, allies, and media had started reaching out to her, sensing that this case had the potential to become much bigger than just a personal grievance. This was about reform, about changing the way the law treated marginalized communities. Her phone buzzed. It was Jason. They're panicking, he said without preamble. I just got off the phone with the department's lawyer. They're offering an apology and an internal review. Angela scoffed, rolling her eyes. An apology? That's all they've got? I'm not interested in apologies, Jason. This isn't about me. This is about everyone who's ever been harassed or mistreated by people like Marks. Jason's voice was calm but firm. I know. And that's why we're going for more than just a settlement. We're filing for a full-scale investigation into the department's practices. We'll aim for changes in policy, mandatory training, and, if possible, prosecution for officers like Marks. Oh. Angela leaned back in her chair, the fire in her eyes matching the determination in her heart. Good. I'm not letting them sweep this under the rug. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. The door to her office opened and her assistant walked in, carrying a folder filled with case files. These are all the police misconduct cases you asked for, she said, placing the thick stack of files on the desk. Thanks, Sarah, Angela replied, giving her a grateful nod. As Sarah left, Angela began flipping through the files, each one filled with stories of individuals who had suffered similar fates: wrongful arrests, racial profiling, excessive use of force. Her blood boiled with every page she turned, the faces and names of the victims blurring together, all tied by the same thread of injustice. Her own case was just one in a long line, but it had the potential to spark real change. With her platform, her legal knowledge, and the public eye now firmly on the situation, she knew she could make a difference. Her thoughts were interrupted by another knock on the door. Jason walked in, followed by several members of her legal team. They took their seats around the conference table, the air thick with anticipation. All right, everyone, Angela said, standing up and facing the group. This isn't just about filing a lawsuit. We're going to use my case to shine a light on the systemic issues within this department and others like it. I want to gather as much evidence as we can. Every misconduct case, every complaint, every instance where someone's rights were violated. One of the attorneys, Maria, nodded in agreement. We've already begun reaching out to past victims. Some of them are hesitant, but we've got a few willing to speak up. The media's already picking up the story, and public support is growing. Angela's eyes narrowed as she considered the weight of what they were about to do. This won't be easy. The police department will fight back. They'll do everything they can to discredit me and anyone else who speaks out. We need to be prepared for that. Jason leaned forward, his expression serious. We're ready, but you're right. They'll come at us hard. We need to make sure our case is airtight. Angela nodded, her mind already racing through potential strategies. Let's start with the internal records. I'm sure there's a history of complaints against Marks and others like him. We'll subpoena those records and make them public. One of the junior attorneys, Daniel, raised his hand slightly. We also need to think about how we're going to deal with the police union. They'll back Marks no matter what. Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. The police union was a powerful force, one that often shielded officers from accountability. But she wasn't afraid of them. She had taken on bigger opponents in the courtroom and won. We'll handle the union when the time comes, she said, her voice steely. Right now, we focus on gathering evidence and building our case. The team spent the next several hours poring over documents, making calls, and organizing their strategy. Angela's office buzzed with activity as the team worked tirelessly, fueled by a shared sense of purpose. Each of them knew that this case wasn't just about Angela's wrongful arrest. It was about changing the system. As the day wore on, Angela couldn't help but think back to the arrest itself. The way Marks had looked at her, the way he had treated her with such disdain, such disregard for her humanity. It was something that countless people of color experienced daily. She had seen it in the courtroom, in the stories of the victims she had fought for. And now she had experienced it firsthand. But she wasn't just any victim. She had the power to fight back, and she was going to use every tool at her disposal to make sure no one else had to endure what she had. Later that evening, as the team wrapped up for the day, Jason lingered behind. He looked at Angela, his expression thoughtful. You know, he said, this case could take a toll on you. The media will turn this into a circus, and you'll be at the center of it." Angela met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. "I've been through worse. And if this is what it takes to make a change, then I'm ready." Jason nodded, clearly impressed by her determination. "All right, but remember, you don't have to do this alone. We're all in this together." "I know," Angela said softly, "but this fight, it's personal." "Oh." Jason gave her a small smile before turning to leave. "Get some rest. We have a long road ahead." After he left, Angela sat back down at her desk, staring at the pile of case files in front of her. She knew Jason was right. The coming weeks and months would be grueling, both emotionally and physically. The media would hound her, the police department would push back with everything they had, and the public scrutiny would be intense. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her close friend and fellow prosecutor, Carmen. "Saw the news. Proud of you. Let me know if you need anything." "Oh," Angela smiled, grateful for the support. She quickly typed back a response. "Thanks. I'll definitely need all the help I can get." "Oh." As she set her phone down, she felt a surge of energy. This fight wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had ever been silenced, mistreated, or oppressed. And she was going to win it, no matter the cost. The media storm hit fast and hard. By the next morning, Angela's face was splashed across the headlines. News outlets, both local and national, were running the story of the wrongful arrest of a high-profile black state prosecutor by overzealous officers. The attention was intense, and with every passing hour the stakes grew higher. Angela sat at her desk, her phone buzzing with messages from journalists requesting interviews. She declined them all for now. Her focus was on the case, not the spotlight. But she couldn't ignore the weight of public opinion. People were taking sides, and the incident was quickly becoming a flashpoint for discussions about race, policing, and systemic injustice. Sarah, her assistant, knocked on the door and entered with a grim expression. "We've got reporters outside the building, and more are gathering. It's getting a little chaotic." Angela sighed, running a hand through her hair. She had expected this, but it was still overwhelming. "I'll have to address them eventually," she said. "But right now, we need to stay focused." Oh. As Sarah left, Jason walked in, holding a tablet. He placed it on Angela's desk and swiped to a video clip of the incident. "You need to see this," he said, his tone serious. Angela leaned forward and watched as footage of her arrest played out on the screen. The shaky phone camera captured everything. The officers stopping her, the rough handling, the crowd's growing unrest. It was hard to watch, even for her. Seeing herself treated like a criminal, knowing how many others had experienced the same thing, sent a surge of anger through her. "They're framing it as a case of blatant racial profiling," Jason said, crossing his arms. "People are furious, and rightfully so." Angela nodded, her jaw clenched. "Good. The more attention we get, the harder it'll be for them to brush this under the rug. But we need to be careful. The police department is going to come after us hard. They'll try to discredit me, make it seem like I provoked them." Jason raised an eyebrow. "And we'll be ready for that. We've already started gathering testimonies from witnesses, and we've got the footage. Marks and Bradley don't stand a chance." "Oh." Angela appreciated his confidence, but she knew better than to underestimate the power of the system they were up against. The police union, the department, and the city's legal team would stop at nothing to protect their own. They'd twist the narrative, paint her as a troublemaker, and use every tool at their disposal to undermine her credibility. "They'll push back with everything they've got," Angela said, standing and walking to the window. "We need to stay ahead of them. I want every detail of Marks and Bradley's records. Any complaints, any history of misconduct, dig it all up." Jason nodded. "We've already started on that. From what we've found so far, Marks has a few complaints against him. Nothing major, but enough to suggest a pattern. Bradley, on the other hand, is clean. He's newer to the force, so they'll probably use him as a scapegoat if things get ugly." "Oh." Angela turned to face him, her expression hard. "I don't care who they try to protect. Both of them need to be held accountable." Jason looked at her with respect. "You're right. We'll make sure of that." The day dragged on as the legal team worked tirelessly, combing through records, gathering evidence, and preparing for what was shaping up to be a high-profile case. The tension in the air was palpable, but Angela thrived under pressure. This was her element. She had faced down tough opponents in the courtroom before, and she was ready to do it again. By late afternoon, Sarah walked in again, this time with an urgent look on her face. "There's someone here to see you," she said quietly. "It's Officer Bradley." Angela's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected either of the officers to reach out, especially not this soon. "Send him in," she said, her voice calm but curious. Moments later, Bradley walked into her office, his posture tense and his face pale. He looked nervous, almost as if he regretted coming, but there was a flicker of determination in his eyes. "Ms. Miller," he began, his voice shaky, I just wanted to apologize." "For what happened?" Angela stared at him, her expression unreadable. She had anticipated some kind of defense or pushback, but not this. She motioned for him to sit down, which he did, albeit awkwardly. "Why are you here, Officer Bradley?" she asked, her tone cool and measured. Bradley shifted in his seat, his hands wringing together. I know what we did was wrong. I realized it as soon as I ran your name through the system. I tried to tell Marks, but he didn't want to listen. And now," he paused, looking down, "now I don't know what to do." Angela leaned back in her chair, studying him. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the uncertainty. He was a young officer, relatively new to the force, caught up in a system that had taught him to follow orders, no matter how unjust. But that didn't absolve him of responsibility. "Do you want me to feel sorry for you?" Angela asked, her voice sharp. Bradley flinched slightly but shook his head. "No, I'm not asking for sympathy. I need to make this right. I can't go on pretending like nothing happened." Angela raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And how exactly do you plan to make it right?" Bradley swallowed hard, his face pale. "I'll testify. I'll tell the truth about what happened, about how Marks pushed me to arrest you, even though I had doubts. I'll admit my role in it. I know I messed up, but I want to take responsibility." For a long moment, Angela said nothing. She was assessing him, weighing his sincerity. It wasn't often that police officers broke ranks, especially not in a situation like this. Bradley had to know that testifying against his partner would make him a target, not just from within the department, but from the police union as well. "You understand what you're risking?" Angela asked, her voice softening slightly. Bradley nodded. "I know, but I can't live with this hanging over me. I became a cop because I wanted to help people, not hurt them. And what we did to you, it was wrong. I can't change what happened, but I can try to make it right." Angela studied him for a moment longer before giving a small nod. "All right, we'll take your testimony. But understand this. This isn't just about clearing your conscience. This is about exposing the system that allows things like this to happen. You'll be helping us do that." Bradley met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "I understand." Angela stood, extending her hand. Bradley hesitated for a moment before standing and shaking it. As he left the office, Angela watched him go, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. His testimony would be a powerful tool in the case, but it wouldn't be enough on its own. They needed more. Jason, who had been listening quietly from the corner, walked over to Angela as soon as Bradley left. "That was unexpected." Angela nodded, her thoughts still on the conversation. "Yeah, but it could work in our favor. His testimony will strengthen our case." Jason crossed his arms, looking thoughtful. "It might, but we're still up against a powerful system. The department will fight this tooth and nail. And Marks, he won't go down without a fight." Angela's gaze hardened. "Let him fight. He won't win." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The media coverage intensified, and Angela found herself becoming the face of a larger movement. She held a press conference, addressing the wrongful arrest and calling for broader reforms in the police department. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive, with civil rights groups rallying behind her cause. But with the increased attention came increased opposition. The police department released a statement defending their officers, claiming that the arrest had been a misunderstanding and that the situation had been handled appropriately. The police union backed Marks and Bradley, stating that they had acted within the scope of their duties. Angela knew this was coming. The system was protecting itself as it always did. But she wasn't deterred. If anything, the department's response only fueled her determination. In the days that followed, more victims of police misconduct came forward, inspired by Angela's story. Some were willing to testify, while others simply shared their stories anonymously, adding to the growing pile of evidence that Angela's legal team was compiling. The case was gaining momentum, and Angela could feel the tide beginning to turn. But she also knew that the real battle was just beginning. The courthouse was swarming with reporters, cameras flashing, and microphones thrust in every direction as Angela stepped out of her car. Dressed in a sleek professional suit, she looked calm and composed, but inside, her nerves hummed with anticipation. Today marked the beginning of the courtroom battle that would determine not only her fate, but also the direction of a much larger movement against systemic injustice. Her legal team flanked her as they entered the courthouse, the atmosphere buzzing with tension. Jason walked beside her, holding a thick binder of documents, while Maria and Daniel, two other attorneys, trailed behind, discussing last-minute adjustments to their strategy. As they passed through the courthouse lobby, Angela noticed the cluster of people gathered in support of her. Many had signs calling for justice and an end to racial profiling. Their presence gave her a sense of strength and resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged by the system. Once inside the courtroom, Angela and her team took their places. On the other side of the room, Marks and Bradley sat at the defense table, flanked by their own lawyers. Marks looked stoic, his jaw set, his eyes cold. Bradley, however, seemed jittery, his eyes flickering nervously across the room. Angela had expected as much. Bradley's decision to testify against Marks was going to be a major turning point in the trial. The judge entered the room, a sharp-looking woman with piercing eyes that suggested she didn't tolerate nonsense in her courtroom. As everyone stood and then sat, the trial officially began. The opening statements were delivered with the usual formality. The defense lawyer painted Marks and Bradley as officers just doing their jobs, caught in a misunderstanding. They portrayed Angela's arrest as an unfortunate mistake, emphasizing the stress and unpredictability of police work. But Angela's team was prepared. Jason delivered a powerful opening, laying out the facts of the case with precision. He highlighted the racial profiling, the unnecessary aggression, and the blatant disregard for Angela's rights, making it clear that this wasn't just about a single incident. It was about a culture of systemic racism within the police department. "We're not just here to seek justice for Ms. Miller," Jason said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "We're here to expose a pattern of abuse and misconduct that has gone unchecked for far too long. This is a fight for accountability, and we will prove that what happened to Ms. Miller is part of a much larger problem." The trial progressed quickly, with witnesses taking the stand. The first few were bystanders who had been present during Angela's arrest. They testified about what they had seen: the unwarranted aggression from the officers, Angela's calm demeanor, and the crowd's growing unease as the arrest unfolded. One witness, a young woman who had recorded the incident on her phone, played the video for the court. The footage was damning. It showed Marks grabbing Angela roughly, shoving her into the police car while she protested calmly. The defense tried to discredit the video, arguing that it didn't show the full context of the situation, but the damage was done. The courtroom was silent as the video played, the images speaking louder than any words. Next, Angela herself took the stand. She recounted the events of that day in meticulous detail, her voice steady and controlled. She didn't embellish or dramatize what had happened. She didn't need to. The truth was powerful enough on its own. "When I told Officer Marks that he was making a mistake, I wasn't just referring to his treatment of me," Angela said, her gaze fixed firmly on the jury. I was referring to the larger mistake of a system that allows officers like him to operate without accountability. This isn't just about me, it's about every person who has been targeted, harassed, or silenced because of the color of their skin. Oh, the defense cross-examined her, trying to trip her up, but Angela was unshakable. Years of courtroom experience had prepared her for this moment, and she handled their questions with ease. They tried to paint her as someone using her position to manipulate the situation, but Angela turned the argument on its head, calmly explaining that her position had made her even more aware of the systemic issues at play. After Angela's testimony, the trial moved on to the most anticipated moment: Officer Bradley's testimony. There was a palpable tension in the room as Bradley took the stand. His eyes flickered nervously to Marks, who sat stony-faced at the defense table. The courtroom held its breath as the young officer swore to tell the truth. Jason approached him with measured steps, his voice calm but probing. "Officer Bradley, can you describe for the court what happened on the day of Ms. Miller's arrest?" Bradley swallowed hard, his gaze shifting to the jury before finally settling on Jason. "We were on patrol," he began, his voice slightly shaky. Officer Marks said he spotted someone who looked suspicious. When we approached Ms. Miller, she wasn't doing anything wrong, but Marks insisted on stopping her." And what happened next?" Jason asked, his tone gentle but firm. Bradley hesitated, glancing briefly at Marks before continuing. "Ms. Miller told us she was a lawyer, but Marks didn't believe her. He said people like her always lie. I didn't agree with what he said, but I didn't stop him either. I followed his lead." Jason's voice remained steady, guiding Bradley through the difficult testimony. "Did you believe at any point that Ms. Miller posed a threat?" Bradley shook his head, his voice growing quieter. "No, she didn't." "And yet you proceeded to arrest her. Why?" Bradley's hands trembled slightly as he answered, his eyes full of regret. "I was following orders. Marks was my superior, and I didn't want to cause any trouble. But I knew it was wrong. I knew we were making a mistake." The courtroom was silent as Bradley's words hung in the air. His testimony was devastating to the defense's case, and the jury's faces were a mixture of shock and disapproval. Jason pressed on. "Did Officer Marks ever express any racial bias during the arrest?" Bradley hesitated for a moment before nodding. "He made several comments about how people like Ms. Miller can't be trusted, that she was probably lying about being a lawyer. It wasn't the first time I'd heard him say things like that." The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Bradley's words landed. The defense scrambled to object, but the damage was done. Bradley's testimony had laid bare the racial bias that had fueled Angela's wrongful arrest. When the defense tried to cross-examine Bradley, they fumbled. The young officer's remorse was clear, and his honesty was hard to refute. He admitted his own role in the arrest, but it was obvious that he had been following Mark's lead, acting out of fear rather than malice. The day ended with a sense of momentum in Angela's favor. The defense looked shaken, while Angela's team remained resolute. But as they left the courtroom, Angela knew the fight wasn't over. The defense would still try to paint her as someone exploiting the situation for personal gain. And the police union would continue to back Marks, no matter how damning the evidence was. Later that evening, Angela sat in her office, going over the day's events with Jason and Maria. They were cautiously optimistic, but Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. Marks was too quiet, too composed, as if he had something up his sleeve. "What's our next move?" Maria asked, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We keep pushing," Angela replied, her voice steady. "We've got the truth on our side, and now the jury knows it. But we can't let our guard down. Marks isn't going to go down without a fight." Jason nodded in agreement. "He'll probably take the stand tomorrow. We need to be ready for anything." Angela leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had come too far to back down now. The trial was more than just a battle between her and Marks. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, for every person who had been mistreated by a system that protected its own at the expense of the truth. And she wasn't going to lose. The next morning, the courthouse was once again buzzing with activity. Reporters scrambled to get in position, eager to capture the day's proceedings. Inside, the tension was thick. Today would likely be the pivotal moment in the trial, the day Officer Marks took the stand. Angela sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded, watching the defense prepare. Jason and Maria were beside her, reviewing notes and strategizing for the cross-examination of Marks. Though Angela remained composed, she could feel the energy in the room shifting. Everyone knew that Marks' testimony could make or break the case. As the judge called the court to order, the defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Delaney, stood and addressed the court. The defense calls Officer Stephen Marks to the stand.
Oh.
Marks rose from his seat, his face emotionless as he made his way to the witness stand. He was a man who had spent years asserting authority and control, and now he would have to answer for it. Angela watched him closely, studying his body language. He looked calm, too calm, as if he believed he could still come out of this unscathed. After being sworn in, Marks sat down, his posture rigid. Delaney wasted no time in beginning his line of questioning, carefully leading Marks through a narrative that painted him as a seasoned officer simply doing his job. "Officer Marks," Delaney began, his voice smooth, "can you describe the events of the day in question?" Marks nodded, his expression neutral. "We were patrolling as usual. I saw Ms. Miller standing on the street, and based on her behavior, I believed she was acting suspiciously." Angela clenched her jaw but stayed silent. She knew this was coming, the attempt to make her look like she had done something to warrant their attention. "And what about her behavior made you suspicious?" Delaney asked. "She was standing near a building, looking around as if she was waiting for someone," Mark said. "In that area, it's common for people to loiter or engage in illegal activity. I approached her to ask some questions, and she became defensive." Delaney nodded as if this confirmed his point. "So, in your professional opinion, you were acting within the scope of your duties?" "Absolutely," Marks replied confidently. "I was following protocol." The defense lawyer continued to frame Marks as a diligent officer, just doing his job under difficult circumstances. Marks emphasized that he had no personal bias, that his actions were based purely on procedure, and that Angela had overreacted to what should have been a routine interaction. But as the questioning continued, Angela noticed a shift in Mark's tone. He became more self-assured, even cocky, as if he believed he was in control of the narrative. Delaney's questions were designed to let Marks portray himself as the victim of a misunderstanding, a good cop being unfairly attacked for doing his job. When Delaney finally finished, Jason stood, preparing for his cross-examination. He walked slowly toward the stand, his steps deliberate, giving the room a moment to absorb the change in tone. "Officer Marks," Jason began, his voice calm but firm, "you've testified that Ms. Miller's behavior was suspicious. Can you explain what specific actions she took that led you to that conclusion?" Marks shifted slightly in his seat, clearly annoyed by the question. "As I said, she was standing near a building looking around. In my experience, that kind of behavior often precedes illegal activity." Jason raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying that simply standing and looking around is enough for you to assume someone might be involved in criminal activity?" Mark stiffened. "It's not just that. It's a combination of factors. The area, the time of day, it all adds up." Jason nodded thoughtfully, then flipped through his notes. "Let's talk about that area. You mentioned it was known for loitering and illegal activity. How many arrests have you personally made in that area?" Marks frowned. "I've made several. It's part of our regular patrol." "And how many of those arrests involved black individuals?" There was a slight pause as Marks hesitated. "I don't have the exact numbers." Jason pressed on. "But it's fair to say that a significant number of those arrests were of black individuals, correct?" Marks's jaw tightened. "That area has a higher population of black residents. It's not about race, it's about following the law." Jason nodded again, letting Mark's words sink in. "Now let's talk about what happened after you stopped Ms. Miller. She informed you that she was a lawyer, correct?" "Yes," Marks replied, his tone clipped. "And did you believe her?" "No. People lie all the time when they're confronted by the police." Jason paused, pacing in front of the jury. You didn't believe her, but when you ran her name through the system, it was confirmed that she was indeed a state prosecutor, wasn't it? Mark's face hardened. Yes. Jason stopped in front of the witness stand, his eyes locking onto Mark's. And despite knowing that, you proceeded to arrest her anyway. Why? Marks shifted uncomfortably, his confidence beginning to crack. She was resisting. I was following protocol. Resisting? Jason asked, his tone incredulous. What exactly did she do to resist? Marks glanced at Delaney, who remained stone-faced. She refused to comply with my orders. She questioned my authority. Jason's voice grew sharper. So, questioning your authority is enough for you to consider someone a threat? Marks opened his mouth to respond, but Jason didn't give him the chance. Let's be clear, Officer Marks, Jason said, his voice rising. You arrested Ms. Miller not because she was a threat, not because she had committed any crime, but because she dared to assert her rights. Isn't that true? Mark's face flushed with anger, but he stayed silent, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. Jason stepped closer, his voice quiet but cutting. The truth is, Officer Marks, you didn't like the fact that a black woman, someone you assumed was powerless, stood up to you. And instead of admitting your mistake, you doubled down. Isn't that what really happened? Mark's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't answer. The courtroom was silent, the tension thick as Jason's words hung in the air. Finally, the judge spoke, her voice calm but firm. Officer Marks, you may answer the question. Marks's eyes flicked toward the jury, his composure cracking under the weight of the moment. I was doing my job. Jason let out a small, humorless laugh. Your job? Right. He turned to the jury, addressing them directly. This isn't about following orders. This is about abuse of power. Officer Marks assumed that because Ms. Miller is a black woman, she could be bullied, disrespected, and silenced. But he was wrong. She stood up for herself, and now we're here, because no one, no matter their race, gender, or profession, should be treated this way by the very people sworn to protect them. Jason returned to his seat, leaving Marks visibly shaken on the stand. Delaney attempted to salvage the defense's case, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The jury's expressions were no longer neutral. They were focused, attentive, and in many cases sympathetic toward Angela. After Marks stepped down, the defense rested. The final moments of the trial were fast approaching, and Angela knew that everything now hinged on the jury's decision. The next day, the courtroom was packed as everyone waited for the jury's verdict. Angela sat beside Jason and Maria, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was nervous, but she remained outwardly composed. This was the culmination of everything they had fought for. The jury filed back into the room, their faces serious. As they sat down, the judge addressed the foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper. We have, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The room was silent, every breath held as the foreman unfolded the paper and began to read. In the case of Miller Veer, Marks and the police department, we, the jury, find the defendants guilty of wrongful arrest and racial discrimination. A wave of emotion washed over Angela as the words sank in. She had won. Justice had been served. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, while supporters in the gallery exchanged looks of relief and triumph. Marks slumped in his seat, his face pale, while Bradley, seated beside him, stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order. The court will reconvene to discuss sentencing and damages. But for Angela, the victory was already sweet. She turned to Jason and Maria, a small smile playing on her lips. We did it. Jason grinned, clapping her on the shoulder. No, Angela, you did it. As they left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into cheers, holding signs and chanting Angela's name. She waved, feeling the weight of their support and the significance of what had just happened. This was more than a personal victory. It was a step toward dismantling a system that had failed too many for too long. And while the fight wasn't over, Angela knew that she had sparked a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The world had taken notice, and change was coming.